The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Love news but find keeping up a bit overwhelming? Well, Newsable is the answer. It's your daily fix of everything worth talking about. I'm your host, Imogen Wells, and in about 15 minutes, I'll bring you what you need to know from Aotearoa and around the world and explain why it matters. Newsable tackles the big stuff without taking itself too seriously. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is brought to you by SparkLab, offering inspiration and practical advice to help businesses find their edge. To hear more about SparkLab, including details about the latest events, workshops, and business tools, visit sparklab.co.nz. And now, here's your host, Simon Pound.
You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is made by the Spinoff with help from Callaghan Innovation, New Zealand's innovation agency. Here's your host, Simon Pound.
It's been a big year in international measurement. A number of the big measures we rely on every day, and for the accurate use of more things in our lives than you might imagine, have swapped out or are in the process of doing so. The kilo is a famous measure kept under glass and lock and key in France that's changing from an actual lump of metal to being kept by quantum measurements based off fundamental laws of physics so as not to change. It turns out that up to now, every now and again the kilo mass shifted, and so would all measurements. Kind of bananas to think about it. It's also been a big anniversary for another standard time. Did you know, and I'm not trying to catch you out if you didn't, that New Zealand was the first place in the world to adopt standard time, adopting Greenwich Mean Time as our base measure before even England did. It's a great story of parochialism and vision all at once, and we were a staggering 15 years ahead of anyone else. The 150th anniversary of that also passed this year. So, to chat time, measure, and the nature of reality, we're joined on the pod by Fleur Francois, Director of New Zealand's National Metrology Institute, the Measurement Standards Laboratory, and Karyn Scherer of Callaghan Innovation. G'day, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, big year in the world of measurements. And tell us a little bit, Fleur, about what it is that the MSL does, the Measurement Standards Laboratory.
We're responsible for maintaining New Zealand's measurement system, and that's the measurement system that we rely on for trade and also for a lot of our basic technology to work. We have about 35 physicists and engineers based in Lower Hutt as part of Callaghan Innovation.
And what do 35 physicists and engineers do to kind of measure and keep track of time?
Well,
and measures and weights and standards.
Well, what they do is they maintain what we call the primary standards. So all measurements are traced back to a primary standard, whether it's the kilogram, the second, the ampere for electricity, or the Kelvin for temperature. So they perform very complex physics experiments in the lab to maintain those standards and make services available to people, which I can tell you a little bit more about.
Why would they have to continually be doing experiments to keep kind of proving and checking these measures?
Because metrologists don't take anything for granted. You always have to prove it, and you constantly need to provide evidence that something is what you say it is. The other thing too is the pace of technological change in measurement is rapidly changing. So it's not just about finding more and more accurate measurements that will enable us to explore the universe, but it's also about coming up with new ways of measuring things so that we can invent and create exciting new products.
And so Are there kind of, these laboratories all around the world where people are replicating the same experiments to make sure that things are all based off the same time or the same measurements or the same understanding?
Yeah. Yeah, and time is actually a great example of where you need everybody in the world using the same system, because global time has to be synchronised. So the way we measure time in New Zealand has to be the same as the way we measure time in London. And all the digital transactions and the internet rely on that synchronised timing, including things like GPS.
I don't know if I'd ever really thought about it, but I guess if I had thought about it, I might have thought that there was one place somewhere where all of this information was kind of transmitted out from, and like one source of truth. Why test the same things all around the world in different places?
What happens is the way that we measure time, for example, is we measure the transition of a cesium atom, and that's how we calculate a second. But no two cesium atom clocks are exactly the same, and so we have to correct for that. And so we send our data to a central place in Paris, and it averages all of the data from all of the national labs around the world, and then it tells us what the global time is, and then how far out we are, and then we all synchronise our clocks to that.
How regularly does that happen?
Continuously. So we're continuously measuring time at Gracefield, at Callaghan, and we're continuously sending that data to Paris, and they're doing the calculations, and the information is coming back to us.
There's actually a really cool example of recently, when we added a global leap second to the time system, just as a really good example of just how important time is to our everyday lives. All the planes that would normally be, flying around the planet actually were held up while we added the second, because that's how important 1 second is to the whole global airline system. It's amazing.
That's remarkable. This idea that constantly the whole world is doing basically a very high-tech version of like at the beginning of a game where everyone goes, okay, synchronize your watches and we'll meet back in 15 minutes.
Yeah, and it's and it really does matter, like Karyn says, because if you think about things like high-frequency financial trading, you've got to be able to timestamp the trades to make sure that there are no errors. And, a millisecond error can translate into millions of dollars of losses in company stock if you get it wrong.
And how about things like calibration is a big part of what the operation does, doesn't it, for companies doing things? Like, what kind of things need to be that finely calibrated?
Okay, so
you'd be amazed.
Yeah.
When I joined Callaghan Innovation, I was just stunned to learn how many things actually depend on it. It's incredible.
Yeah, like aviation, for example.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realise how much measurement goes into making sure that your Air New Zealand plane flies safely and doesn't come apart mid-flight.
It's very reassuring to hear that all of this is going on in the background with it. What about GPS?
Absolutely.
So GPS relies on really accurate timing. And so one of the exciting things about how technology development and measurement translates into new applications is the development of GPS. So that was based on more accurate timing created by the invention of the atomic clock. What that means in practice is if for any reason the synchronization of the timing goes out, even by, a few milliseconds, that can translate into kilometres of inaccuracy in terms of the positioning of those satellites.
Is that the same atomic clock that's used to work out the second, or is it a different kind of atomic clock?
The technology is essentially the same. So there are atomic clocks on satellites.
Does this kind of surprise, I guess at parties, people are like, what do you do? And you're like, well, time. And you're like, yeah. And you're like, make sure that it's right. And it's all such a construct, yet it's also important. And it's constructed out of a whole series of, it seems quite arbitrary and unusual kind of experiments.
I think it is really something that captures people's imagination. So people are blown away when I say, oh yeah, there's a guy that works for me who's the Time Lord, and he is in charge of official time. And then people usually ask me, oh, well, can you change the time and give me an extra hour in the day or something else?
Yeah, and the kind of, we take, like, just as, lay people, all of the stuff for granted or very much kind of as expected that time is a constant or weight is a constant or measurement is. But is it like quite a contested area? Like, are there different schools of thought on it, or are there competing ways to measure it? Or
I think we're quite fortunate in that globally, all the countries have agreed that this is how we're going to have a measurement system, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to trade, and otherwise, the technology wouldn't work. And the way that we do that is New Zealand is a signatory to the Meter Convention, and we meet every few years and we discuss the global measurement system and make decisions about any changes.
And we take that to be, especially in a non-imperial measurement system place, we're kind of like a little bit kind of proud of our meters. It makes so much sense. It's based on 100 of this, and then it breaks down to 10, and it breaks down to 1. But even the meter is wildly arbitrary, isn't it? As the first measure of it.
Well, originally, when they developed the meter during the French Revolution, they based it on a fraction of distance across the earth, which was completely unpractical. Then they decided that they were going to make this metal bar that would be the reference. But now actually we measure the meter using lasers, and it's based on a scientific equation using the speed of light. So incredibly accurate, incredibly stable, can be replicated anywhere in the universe.
But it's probably a testament, really, to how important measurement is, and the fact that, we all know that America likes to be a bit different to the rest of the world and is still holding out with imperial measurements. But in fact, in the scientific community, Fleur, don't they?
Yeah.
The opposite is in fact the case, because you need to have those sort of universal systems and that just to enable you to do sort of scientific development.
And the meters change was kind of big news a little while ago, and this year it's been the path of the kilogram. So talk us through how that goes and how that impacts, an agency in Lower Hutt. From kind of Paris to Lower Hutt, there's changes happening all around the world.
Okay, well, this is the really crazy thing. So much of our measurement system and our technology relies on this lump of metal in a vault in Paris, which is over 100 years old. And there's only one of this thing, which is called the International Prototype Kilogram, or Le Grand K. And, if anything was to happen to this thing, we'd lose the definition of mass in the universe. It's so ridiculous. The other thing, too, is we know that this object is not stable. It could be gaining or losing mass, depending on what you do. If you bring it out of its little vault and you give it a clean, you could be taking atoms off it. If, God forbid, anybody touched it, you'd be putting atoms on it, and you'd automatically make the standard heavier, and we'd all lose weight overnight. So it's not a sort of a stable way to measure mass or to be used as a source for technology development.
But up until now, have they, in a quite literal sense, been getting it out of the vault every couple of years, chucking it on the scales, and then going, that's a kilogram, and then everyone's kilogram measures are updated all around the world for things like, kilograms of pressure in spaceships and stuff?
Yeah, so at a very high level, conceptually that's right, but because this thing is so precious, and by precious I mean there are 3 keys held by different people, and they all have to come in and open it in the vault, and they've only taken it out, I think, 3 or 4 times since it went in the vault.
A bit like the recipe for Coke, isn't it? Yeah.
I know, it's crazy. So what they have is they have 6 official copies, and what used to happen was, for New Zealand, we would send our standard kilogram to Paris to be compared to one of these official standard copies, and then we would apply a correction factor to our kilogram, and then when other people in New Zealand would send us their stuff to be calibrated, we would then compare it to our standard.
And make an absolutely minute correction, and then you'd say to someone, okay, your kilogram is a kilogram and give them a kind of official tick.
Yeah, and I guess where this matters, because honestly, you don't have to worry about the weight of your bananas at the supermarket. I don't think anybody's being, shortchanged there. But where it does matter is when you're using that as a basis to measure mass at very small amounts. So if you think of things like the manufacture of pharmaceutical drugs, where you're wanting to measure very small quantities of active ingredients, you can see how using this sort of system is not really, the best way of doing it.
And so, were you surprised to find out just how kind of like analog and you kind of, I don't know, you kind of expect things to be a little bit more set than that?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit of context as to why it's taken so long to fix this, why, Le Grand K is the last artefact. And it's because the way to calculate the kilogram using the laws of physics, you need to know what Planck's constant is.
Which sounds, this is my mum joke here, sounds a bit like something Max Key was doing on the internet a few years ago, doesn't it? Yeah. Sorry, that's my contribution. Continue, Fleur.
So measuring Planck's constant has...
I've now just got
I'm sorry.
I've got an image.
I've ruined that now, haven't I?
Yeah.
Measuring Planck's constant has actually been one of the hardest scientific experiments to do in the world. It's taken decades. And I actually heard a Nobel Prize winner at the meeting in Paris say that it is one of the 5 hardest scientific experiments to do in the world. It's up there with the Hadron Collider and the Higgs boson. It's that difficult. And so it's taken hundreds of person years and to be able to develop the technology to be able to measure Planck's constant.
What is Planck's constant? And why does it relate to finding a standardized way for anyone in the world to be able to replicate it to then go, yes, that is the mass of a kilogram?
Planck's constant is the energy in one photon of electromagnetic radiation to the frequency of that radiation. So it's a value in the natural world, which is inherently stable. It's part of the laws of physics, and it can be tested anywhere in the universe. So essentially, Planck's constant is a value that we plug into a scientific equation in order to be able to calculate a kilogram. So we can then build machines and devices that use Planck's constant that will then tell us what a kilogram is.
It does seem remarkably complicated, doesn't it? From kind of the simplicity of like a lump of metal to, interrelationships between frequencies and radiation at an atomic level.
It's a lot more stable and a lot more safer for the world than relying on, some dodgy object in a vault that could be destroyed. And this is not hypothetical. In the 19th century, the poor British, they lost their standard yard because there was a fire in Parliament where it was stored. And I have visions of it just being this, melted lump of metal.
And you've just recently been over to Paris where all of this has been kind of going down. What was done to mark the end of the analog era with this? And I mean, is this an unusually big year in the world of metrology, the world of measuring things?
It is a big year for metrologists, essentially because we have cracked the last bastion of having to use a physical object to get a measurement. We've finally reached the point where there are enough experiments that have been done around the world that we can set a value for Planck's constant. Also, at the same time, we have moved from the analog world to the more digital world for other measurements, like the Kelvin and temperature. That will be based on another physical constant called Boltzmann's constant. And we've also fixed the value for the elementary charge, which is used to calculate the ampere, which is critical for electricity. And the reason this matters is this new technology is going to enable a whole lot of other technology developments, whether it's more accurate predictions about climate change, from the improved temperature measurement through to better electronic devices and longer lasting batteries through better electricity measurement.
What did they do for heat prior to this? For the Kelvin, the measure of temperature?
I was worried you were going to ask me this because I'm not a physicist, Simon.
Yes.
I have to admit, I'm a biochemist. But essentially the object that they use to calculate the Kelvin is something called the triple point of water. And the triple point of water is the temperature at which water exists in its three states. So that's as, a solid, a liquid and a gas in perfect equilibrium. And that translates to, I think, 273.1 Kelvin.
My 15-year-old has just discovered this and was gleefully regaling me the other day of trying to explain to me how water could actually exist in three different forms. I have to admit, it did take him about 10 minutes to explain it to me for me to fully understand. It's really cool.
It is remarkable, and I do apologise to any science-minded people that even the characterisation of my questions must have been causing people difficulties swapping in mass and weight and all kinds of things. But, it really rubs in the fact that, if we were dropped on a desert island or, 400 years back in history and people were like, well, how did you do things? So many people just would not be able to help at all. There's so much of what we do in our daily life that we just kind of take all of the base levels for granted. And I wonder, another area like this year, like in anniversary news, the 150-year anniversary of Standard Time. And that's remarkable, to think that New Zealand was the first place in the world to adopt Standard Time. And it was so recent, really, like 150 years ago, the idea that everywhere around New Zealand before that, every kind of centre kept its own time and they were different. And proudly different.
Yeah, well, Invercargill at one point was 20 minutes ahead of Wellington. It's just because nobody had any accurate way of they all their clocks were mechanical and differed in different ways to.
What was it based on?
Time.
Like were they trying to be standard at some point, or was it kind of based on when the sun came up, or what was time in each of these areas based on before it became standard?
Clocks were actually synchronised on the basis of, the movement of the sun. And so when you think about the geography of New Zealand, the sun rises a lot earlier at one end of the country than it does in the other. And that's why there were different time zones with different minutes. And because there wasn't a lot of communication in real time across the country, nobody really knew that they were like 20 minutes ahead of Invercargill.
And would the town clock be kind of a very localized version of like the Paris clock today, where the town clock in the centre of Oamaru might have a time, and then everyone who had a watch would go, oh, yep, my time is right to the clock, and then they'd tell other people around them what the time was, and then they'd all have to recalibrate?
That's exactly it. Whoever controlled the town clock controlled the town's time, and everybody else had to match their watches to that.
And why did people have to change 150 years ago? And what was the point of contention about changing?
Well, it's really funny when you think about 150 years ago, but it was for New Zealand, the country was rapidly growing and there was a rapid pace of technological change. The advent of the railway and the telegraph essentially connected parts of New Zealand that weren't connected to each other previously. And so what happened was there was a lot of frustration because people would try and send a telegraph from one end to the other of the country, but it wouldn't get through properly because the offices were opening and shutting at different times.
Oh yeah, I'm going to get this off before the day closes. It's 4:55, and then the place has been closed for 20 minutes down in Invercargill.
Yeah, and you can imagine trying to synchronise your railway timetables, and it all came to a head over 150 years ago when they laid a cable between the North and South Island, because that just made the situation even worse. So the Central Telegraph Office in Wellington said, right, this is enough. New Zealand time is based on the time at the Wellington Telegraph Office, and all your other telegraph offices around New Zealand, you have to synchronise your clocks to this time. And chaos broke out because there was no way the South Island was living under Wellington time. particularly when you consider that at that time of our history, over 2/3 of the population lived in the South Island.
Yeah, and Dunedin was the centre of wealth and power. Otago, rather, was the centre of wealth and power, which, you can tell as you walk around now and you go, wow, this is it's beautiful, but no longer feels the centre of power.
Yeah, although the way things are going, I think they're trying pretty hard to reclaim that.
And that idea of not being able to settle on one local time frame sent people to Greenwich in England.
Well, there was an idea to set it on some sort of reference point, and I can't remember exactly. I think the exact the difference between New Zealand Standard Time and Greenwich. I think it's something about 11 hours and 30 minutes. But essentially what happened was there was a debate in Parliament after the Wellington Telegraph Office did what they did. And in the end, a compromise was reached, and they based it on solar time in Canterbury, which everybody was prepared to go with.
It seems so remarkable to me that, if this was an issue in New Zealand that, 150 years ago was reasonably lowly populated and didn't have an enormous amount of interprovincial kind of stuff going on, you'd think somewhere like, I don't know, France or Germany that had, millions of people all doing cross-border and cross-county trade and all must have had huge needs for time. But even so, New Zealand was 15 years ahead of anywhere else to adopt a standardised time, let alone for a whole continent to adopt a standardised idea of time.
Yeah, I'm not sure what was happening in those other countries at the time, but I get the impression that we just seem to be able to get stuff done faster.
Yeah, which has been a constant in our entire history. I mean, we've had so many firsts. I mean, look at the giving women the vote and, all sorts of things. I think, that's where our size actually really does help. We just get stuff done.
What an absolute shambles it must have been. And I wonder if in 150 years from now, people will be looking back and they'll go, and it was 150 years ago, they had a lump of metal, and that's how they measured mass. Exactly. And I wonder if it'll be the same kind of. And how has this been marked around the country, this idea of us being the first in the world to hit standard time?
We had a celebration very recently where we had some interesting speakers at the National Library who shared a bit of the history, and we had an exhibit where we showed a lot of the history of timekeeping in New Zealand. But actually, it's one of those little-known historical facts about us.
Yeah, there's actually, if anyone's interested to learn more about this, there's actually a really cool article on the Spinoff that's actually details some of the really cool stories around this, like the fact that we used to fly the atomic clock, first class around the world to match it up with other atomic clocks, and there's some really really cool anecdotes that people can read for themselves.
How did that work?
Yeah.
Like an actual physical clock.
An actual physical clock would sit in first class with its own. It was Mr. C. Beam, I think was the name, wasn't it?
Yeah, we couldn't put atomic on the manifest.
You can't make jokes about bombs and you can't call things atomic.
There's actually a photo of it on the Spinoff website. If you look it up, strapped in with its seatbelt, it's hilarious.
And then it would come back, and that would be time here. Yeah, remarkable. And so, where's the technology going? So that, we laugh back at that, the 70s, ha, ha, ha. But, things are moving so much faster. Now, what does this enable? What does having a measurement lab enable us to do here? And there's actually kind of local innovations in that space, hey? So we've got our own version of the measurement equipment that allows you to do, what is it, a kind of quick and dirty version of the meter measurement.
Speaking of getting stuff done, it's another really cool Kiwi innovation. There's a scientist in Wellington, Dr. Chris Sutton, who's actually he's won international awards for this. In fact, he was nominated this year, I think, for the Wellingtonian of the Year. He's a really clever metrologist, and he's helped develop this tool that's known as the kibble balance, but he's basically developed a desktop version of something that's, everyone else's looks like the old, IBM computers of old. And he's developed this really sort of miniaturized version. It's the, only one in the world at this point. And we have the only kibble balance in the Southern Hemisphere. So, that's classic example of actually how New Zealand can really lead the world in this stuff.
That's such an elegant solution to what I imagine you can't just kind of that easily spin up a measurement that complicated.
Yeah, so Chris was very forward thinking. So he realised about 10 years ago that this was the way that the measurement world was going. And he looked at the kibble balances that have been built in the Northern Hemisphere, which are huge and cost millions, and are incredibly accurate because they had to be used to calculate Planck's constant. And he thought, well, okay, New Zealand, that's not going to happen here. But we are going to need access to really high accuracy measurements of the kilogram once the global system changes. And so he developed his own version of those super engineered kibble balances for us to be able to calculate the kilogram. He essentially saw a world where we will democratise the kilogram. It won't be something that only, PhD physicists in a national lab can do. It's something that we can actually make available to the broader industrial community. I mean, there might be a world in the future where a lot of manufacturing operations have their own kibble balance, particularly if you're manufacturing, say, pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have thought about it, but I guess I would have thought a lot of this stuff would have been done by mathematical equation rather than based off kind of basic laws of standard measures in physics, like, immutable laws of nature.
Yeah, when you think about it, I mean, there's just so much of industry is tied up with things like temperature and pressure and measurement. I mean, the electricity industry, the aviation industry, pharmaceuticals. It's actually a really fundamental part of manufacturing that most of us obviously never think about. But once you actually look into it, and you realise how incredibly important it is.
Yeah, there are some really practical applications. So as well as doing, cutting edge physics, we make that available to industry in New Zealand. So quite often a company will have a particular production issue, and many times the issue is related to measurement. So just to give you an example, we've done a lot of work in the petroleum industry and also industrial processes like methanol production in Taranaki, where they have very high temperature furnaces to manufacture their products. And temperature control and measurement is absolutely critical to their operation. If they run the temperature too hot, you could have a meltdown in your factory. But if you don't run the temperature hot enough, you don't get a very good yield. And we did some work with an operation in Taranaki where we were actually able to show them how to optimise the temperature control in their furnace. And it translated into over $1 million of operating savings a year. So measurement really does matter if you want to be able to manufacture things more efficiently.
That's so cool. And as a final thought there, how do people get involved with the MSL? How do people come and avail themselves of the 35 amazing scientists, physicists, technicians in the laboratory?
We are open to any inquiries from businesses out there. We can be reached at measurement.govt.nz.
They have a fantastic website, actually, that's got a lot of really cool stories about the work they do.
Ah, cool. And are you able to kind of wander and come visit and see kind of our measures? Is that like
there's a lot of building work going on at the moment, actually.
We periodically do actually open up our labs and bring people around because people are really fascinated by this stuff, and we get to do some really cool variable stuff. I mean, for me, it's amazing that we do everything from working with the aviation industry through to working with digital effects industry. And, I mean, I never know what weird and wonderful things my staff are going to be testing in the lab. I mean, I remember one day I just about tripped over a set of traffic lights in the corridor because our light measurement lab was testing all these traffic lights to make sure they met the standard.
Ah, that's so cool. Thank you for coming and sharing the story today. That's Fleur Francois, who's the director at the Measurement Standards Laboratory, and to Karyn Scherer, Communications at Callaghan. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And And thank you to Tina Tiller for producing. And thank you for listening. If you would like to find more, head along to measurement.govt.nz.
You've been listening to Business is Boring, presented by Simon Pound. And brought to you by the Spinoff and Callaghan Innovation.
From the Spinoff Podcast Network, that was Business is Boring, brought to you by SparkLab. Make sure you're following Business is Boring wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information on SparkLab, visit sparklab.co.nz. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.